Almost 50 years ago, the perfect storm of social, political, and economic failures triggered a wave of revolt in Iran.
University students demonstrating in Tehran shouting death to the Shah pledge allegiance to the Islamic movement of the Ayatollahs.
The mullahs pledged they would end corruption, empower the working class, and give everyone a voice, regardless of political party or religion.
همه امور دست خود ملت است. امروز مثل زمان رژیم طاغوتی نیست که ملت هیچ کاره باشد و همه امور دست یه نفر یا یه عده باشد.
But they failed to deliver on many of those promises. So as we sit here today in January of 2026, a new uprising is brewing.
In Iran, defiance reignited. Hundreds of thousands marched across the nation, tearing up flags of the Islamic Republic and chanting, "Death to the dictator, Ayatollah Khamenei."
Tehran's streets are filled with protesters. But it's not just Tehran. All throughout the country, Mashhad, Bandar Abbas, Urmia, Abdanan, a snowball is beginning to form and it's beginning to barrel down the proverbial slope. Khamenei has shut off the internet and deployed the Islamic Revolutionary Guard to halt the, quote, spread of insecurity. There's wild speculation about Khamenei potentially fleeing to Moscow if his forces are unsuccessful. Could these reports be overblown? Absolutely. But sitting here 7,000 miles away in the US, it feels like Iran's regime is facing an existential crisis, and it feels like their grip on the nation is slipping. Who would replace them? I don't know, but what I do know is that another revolution in Iran could breathe new life into the nation's civil aviation sector, which has been decimated by near-complete isolation from the Western world. It could catalyze a total transformation of air travel in the country, potentially ending decades of sanctions and reviving the country's airlines, especially Iran Air. Regular viewers of the channel would know that Iran Air was once great. They were the fastest growing airline in the world during the 1970s. They were well managed, they turned consistent profits, and dare I say they were on a glide path to become the next Turkish Airlines or Emirates. But the revolution quickly killed the airline's momentum and essentially froze them in time. It is a tragic story, but also a fascinating one, and I've covered almost every inch of it to the best of my ability as a Westerner, from the founding of Iranian Airways in 1944 all the way up until the early 2000s. So if you want to learn about Iran Air's first 60 or so years in business, check out part 1 and part 2 of this series. But for now, let's pick up our story in the mid-2000s. Air travel demand in Iran is actually quite strong, but the country's airlines are struggling to keep up. Iran Air Tours, Caspian Airlines, Mahan Air, and Iran Asiman Airlines are all barred from doing business with Boeing and Airbus. But that's old news. By now, they've figured out how to extend the shelf life of their 727s, 737s, 747s, A300s, and A310s, but maintenance is becoming more and more costly. Spare parts are hard to come by. They either need to cannibalize or acquire parts on the black market. When you acquire parts on the black market, they often don't come with proof they've been properly maintained. Without airworthiness documentation, you risk some serious safety consequences. Some turn to Russia for Tupolevs and Yakovlevs, notably Iran Air Tours and Caspian Airlines. But those planes often were just as old as the Boeings and Airbuses, and they didn't have the greatest safety records either. 168 people died in a Caspian Airlines Tupolev 154 crash in 2009, which later led the Iranian Civil Aviation Organization to ban the operation of the aircraft. Sanctions were largely triggered by Iran's nuclear activities. Now, whether Iran should or shouldn't have nukes is entirely outside of the scope of this video, and something I absolutely will not comment on. But I think we can all agree that many Western countries felt like Iran shouldn't have nukes, and they felt Iran wasn't being honest about its uranium enrichment activities. So they turned up the heat in a coordinated global effort to paralyze the country's economy. And unfortunately, the aviation sector was collateral damage to this effort. Any Iranian aircraft that flew into Europe was subject to search. Authorities were on the lookout for any prohibited materials that could be used to enrich uranium or build nukes. The definition of prohibited materials was expanded to include what they call dual-use technology. technology that could be used on civilian planes like the 737, but could also be used for military purposes to build nukes and missiles. Many aviation parts, high-grade aluminum, specialized engines, and navigational equipment now fell under this dual-use category, so the entire aviation sector was treated as a potential military supply chain. The maximum pressure campaign extended beyond parts procurement. It also impacted Iranian airlines' ability to refuel at foreign airports. BP was the most notable example. They refused to fuel up Iran Air planes at Heathrow, Hamburg, and Frankfurt, not because it was illegal, but because they wanted to protect their business interests in the United States. As a result, Iran Air aircraft had to tanker fuel from Tehran, limiting passenger capacity, or make technical stops in other countries that would allow them to buy fuel. Even if Iran Air had the money to buy fuel and parts, which they actually did, it didn't matter. Financial sanctions basically scared away foreign banks from processing any Iran Air transactions because if they did, they could be kicked out of the US financial system. So Iran Air turned to what they call the shadow banking system, using exchange houses and front companies in third-party countries like the UAE and Turkey to move money. These intermediaries, of course, demanded a fee for their services, which meant that Iran Air was now paying 10 to 30% more for each individual transaction than they otherwise would have. Not to mention, selling tickets in foreign countries was extremely difficult. Iran Air was pulled from the global distribution systems like Amadeus and Sabre. These are systems that allow you to see flights on Google Flights, Expedia, Priceline, and more. So Iran Air was basically invisible online. If you were in Paris or Tokyo and wanted to book a flight with Iran Air, you'd have to walk into an Iran Air office and either pay in cash or transfer funds directly from your bank. General sales agents like Adina Travel would sometimes take credit cards, but since they were taking on more risk, they also charged more for tickets, making Iran Air's flights very expensive compared to the competition. Speaking of the competition, they had an absolute field day during the 2010s. Turkish Airlines was the primary beneficiary, but also Qatar and Emirates. They were easier to buy tickets with, they operated vastly newer planes, and they were safer and more reliable. As a result, Iran Air's international market share deteriorated significantly from about 68% in the year 2000 to just 22% in 2015. Keep in mind that by this time, Iran Air was basically a flying museum. Their fleet was a time capsule of 1970s and 1980s aviation technology. They had Boeing 747 SPs, 747-200s, and A300s. The newest planes in the fleet were Fokker 100 regional jets. Fokker went out of business in the 90s. Now, while old aircraft aren't exactly appealing to the everyday traveler, they were attractive to aviation enthusiasts. During this time, Avgeeks flocked to Iran Air to check out the last passenger 747 SP. Sam Chui's coverage of the airline was mostly positive, and the first inside look many foreigners got into the airline in years. For me, watching that video made me realize that Iran Air is more than just an instrument of the Islamic regime. It's a living archive of Iranian identity, professional pride, and a home legacy that predates the current political era. The airline is still home to thousands of hardworking pilots, engineers, cabin crew, mechanics, and ground staff who aren't trying to push an agenda on Iran Air passengers. Their primary goals are safety and hospitality. When sanctions were lifted in 2016, Iran Air didn't waste any time. They placed an order for 200 aircraft with Airbus, Boeing, and ATR. At list prices, the order was worth about $36 billion, but it was probably going to be closer to $20 billion with discounts. That's a lot of money, but it also reflected the reality that Iran was scrambling to replace its entire civil aviation infrastructure before the political climate inevitably shifted and sanctions were reimposed. Their primary concern was the outcome of the 2016 US presidential election. And indeed, within a year of taking office, President Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, effectively putting Iran back on the blacklist. Iran Air was only able to take delivery of 16 of the 200 aircraft it ordered, 1 A321, 2 A330s, and 13 ATRs. 5 of the ATRs arrived in Tehran just hours before the sanctions snapback. While the arrival of any new planes was a triumph, the long-term reality would be difficult. With Iran again isolated from Western companies, it couldn't get spare parts or support for the new aircraft. Additionally, it took on about $700 million in debt to buy the planes, which it's now struggling to pay back due to weak financial performance. The airline has only had intermittent access to its most lucrative international destinations like London, Paris, Amsterdam, Berlin, and Frankfurt, and as we sit here today in early 2026, it is flying to none of them. Iran Air still flies to international destinations in the Middle East like Istanbul and Dubai, where there's plenty of demand, but those routes are also highly competitive and less profitable. Now, typically, by this point, I would have referenced CEOs or leaders that made their mark on the airline, but with Iran Air, each CEO was a little bit hamstrung. They were more like survival managers than traditional airline executives. You could have put in any of the storied airline turnaround architects, Gordon Bethune, Michael O'Leary, Willie Walsh, and I'd argue Iran Air would still be a dumpster fire. Recent events have resulted in arguably the most severe sanctions since the 1979 revolution. In 2022, Iran was accused of assisting Russia with its military operation in Ukraine, and then this past year they went to war with Israel. In January of 2026, aka now, the whole country seems to be in economic freefall. The annual inflation rate has been close to 50%, meaning that basic necessities like meat and rice are significantly more expensive than they used to be. This is just one of the reasons that people are taking to the streets. The unrest has led foreign airlines, even ones from friendly neighboring countries like Turkish Airlines, Qatar, and Fly Dubai, to cancel flights to the country. About half of Iran Air's own fleet is now grounded. The financial outlook is quite bleak, given the inability to operate much of its international schedule and bring in foreign currency revenue. Domestic flights continue, but digital blackouts have apparently made it very difficult to 1. Book flights online, and 2. Check the status of those flights. Iran Air's future very much hangs in the balance. I don't think they're going away, even if the current regime prevails, but if the people choose a different direction, whether that's Pahlavi or someone else, things could get really interesting. Without the shackles of sanctions, Iran Air could renew the fleet, join alliances, add new international destinations, perhaps even one day restore service between Tehran and New York. Heck, with the right planes, the right people, and the right plan, they could even be profitable again, delivering both cash and credibility to the nation and its people. What do you guys think the future has in store for Iran Air? Let me know in the comments. Thanks again for joining me on this beast of a series, and I wish you the safest and happiest of travels wherever your journeys may take you. So long.